Chapter 27. Start with two women. Phyllis Schlafly, lawyer, mother of 6, and the single person most responsible for killing the Equal Rights Amendment. Before she was a face of social conservatism, Schlafly was a seasoned policy expert on nuclear strategy, writing books that argued for a massive military buildup against the Soviet Union. Pauli, lawyer, civil rights litigator, ordained as the first black woman Episcopal priest, someone who spent a lifetime quietly wrestling with a gender identity that didn't fully fit the categories available to her. Murray developed the legal architecture for what she called Jane Crow, arguing that the same logic used against racial segregation must apply to sex discrimination. Her legal theories were so influential that Ruth Bader Ginsburg would later list Murray as a co-author on her first major Supreme Court brief in 1971. Both women, both lawyers, both mothers, in Murray's case to a movement more than biological children. And they end up on absolutely opposite sides of the exact same question. What does women's freedom actually mean? That disagreement, not a cartoon villain versus hero story, is basically this entire chapter in miniature. This isn't just the Nixon and Carter years, it's the hinge between the rights revolutions of the 1960s you just covered and the long conservative ascendancy that runs from Reagan all the way through the politics you've grown up inside. During these 12 years, the political center of gravity in America shifted fundamentally as the New Deal order that had defined the country for 40 years began to crumble. Almost every institution and argument driving American politics right now, the think tanks, the religious right, the tax revolt, the culture war over identity, gets built or launched in these 12 years specifically. We're covering 6 things. 1. The 1968 election and the law and order politics that reshaped both parties. 2. Nixon's war and diplomacy, the messy end of Vietnam alongside genuine Cold War breakthroughs. 3. Watergate and what it did to public trust in government. 4. The economic earthquake, the end of the post-war boom, stagflation, and the beginning of the Sun Belt and Rust Belt split. 5. How liberalism actually kept winning real victories throughout this supposedly conservative decade. And 6. The deliberate, well-funded institutional machinery conservatives built to make sure the 1980s would look nothing like the 1960s. Let's get into it. "1968 might be the single most violent, chaotic year in modern American political history. In February, police opened fire on a civil rights protest at South Carolina State, killing 3 students. By August, the chaos reached the heart of the Democratic Party in Chicago, where the whole world was watching as police charged protesters in a downtown park. The convention left Hubert Humphrey leading a party shattered by internal divisions over the war and racial justice, opening the door for a conservative challenger. April brought the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and June took Robert Kennedy. The country felt like it was tearing itself apart in real time. Overseas, French students battle riot police in Paris, Soviet tanks crush a reform movement in Czechoslovakia, and campuses from Mexico City to Tokyo erupt in protest. A genuinely global year of upheaval, not just an American one. Into that chaos steps Richard Nixon, running against Democrat Hubert Humphrey and third-party segregationist George Wallace. Nixon makes a calculated bet. Rather than compete with Wallace for the most overt racist vote, he positions himself as the law and order candidate, explicit code, understood by everyone at the time, for reining in black militancy and urban unrest without saying so outright. He courts Southern white voters by promising to ease federal civil rights enforcement and oppose court-ordered busing, and he frames his entire campaign around what he calls the silent majority, ordinary Americans exhausted by riots, campus radicals, and an unpopular war, people one political analyst bluntly described as the unyoung, the unpoor, and the unblack. Nixon wins, but barely, and the real story is in the combined numbers. Nixon and Wallace together take 57% of the popular vote, a massive rightward swing from Johnson's landslide just 4 years earlier. Plenty of northern working-class Democrats who'd voted for Johnson in 1964 defect to Wallace or Nixon in 1968, specifically over busing, urban unrest, and a sense that the party had stopped speaking to them. A realignment of white working-class voters away from the Democratic coalition that political scientists are still mapping the long tail of today. The new left that dominated headlines in Chapter 26 has, in electoral terms, been answered by an assortment of old and new conservatives determined to roll back the Great Society, not always by repealing it outright, but by starving its funding and reframing its beneficiaries as the problem rather than the people it was meant to help. It's worth naming, too, that this shift happened inside both parties, not just the Republican one. That law and order playbook doesn't retire with Nixon. Reagan campaigns on it. George H.W. Bush's 1988 campaign runs the Willie Horton ad off the same emotional logic. From Reagan's welfare queen to the 1988 Willie Horton ad, the emotional logic of 1968 remained the bedrock of American conservative campaigning. Even 21st century slogans like defund the police are arguing against the framework that first sold Americans on the idea that crime and justice were identical threats. Nixon had hinted at a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. There wasn't one. His actual strategy, Vietnamization, pulls American ground troops out gradually while shifting the fighting to the South Vietnamese Army, a slower version of the exact same war. To maintain pressure on the North while ground troops were withdrawn, Nixon launched the heaviest bombing campaigns in history, expanding the war's footprint. And winding down doesn't mean less violence. In 1969, Nixon secretly and illegally bombs neutral Cambodia to disrupt enemy supply lines, then formally invades it in 1970. The bombing destabilized the Cambodian government and created a vacuum that allowed the radical, ultra-communist Khmer Rouge to seize control. That operation destabilizes the country badly enough to help bring the Khmer Rouge to power, a regime that would go on to murder roughly 2 million of its own citizens within a few years. The invasion of Cambodia detonates campus protests nationwide. At Kent State University in Ohio, National Guard troops opened fire on unarmed student demonstrators, killing 4. By 1972, more than 70% of Americans in polls call the war a mistake, and that shift accelerates in 1971 when the New York Times and Washington Post published the Pentagon Papers, a leaked classified history proving the Kennedy and Johnson administrations had systematically misled the public for years about the war's actual prospects. The papers proved that the government had consistently lied to the public about the war's prospects, viewing victory as impossible while continuing to send soldiers to die. A peace agreement finally gets signed in January 1973, but it doesn't bring peace, just an American exit. Saigon falls to North Vietnamese forces in 1975. The war's final toll, 58,000 American dead, and somewhere north of 2 million Vietnamese, on both sides, plus civilians. The war cost 58,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese lives, leaving a legacy of doubt about the limits of American power. Nixon's foreign policy elsewhere is genuinely more successful and more cynical, often in the same breath. He and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger pursued détente with the Soviet Union, easing Cold War tension and signing the first major nuclear arms limitation treaty, while simultaneously opening formal diplomatic relations with Communist China, specifically to exploit the rivalry between Beijing and Moscow, playing the two communist powers against each other. Kissinger's realpolitik prioritized stability and balance of power over moral or ideological concerns, a strategy he called triangular diplomacy. But Nixon's realism has a dark underside. When Chile's democratically elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, nationalizes American-owned properties, the CIA backs a coup in 1973 that leads to Allende's death and installs a military dictatorship that rules for nearly 2 decades. The United States backs similarly repressive regimes in Nicaragua, South Africa, the Philippines, and Iran, whenever those regimes served American strategic or economic interests better than democracy would have. That specific pattern, quietly propping up dictators when they're useful and preaching democracy when it's convenient, is exactly the history Latin American and Middle Eastern governments and populations still point to today whenever they're skeptical of American motives. The 1973 Chile coup specifically remains one of the most cited, best documented examples of exactly that pattern in the historical record. Not a conspiracy theory, but declassified fact. The Nixon administration regularly propped up repressive right-wing dictatorships globally, provided they were anti-communist and friendly to U.S. business. In June 1972, 5 men break into Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, looking initially like a routine burglary. It wasn't. The break-in had been authorized by Nixon's own re-election committee, part of a broader pattern. A secret team nicknamed the Plumbers had already illegally broken into the office of a psychiatrist treating Daniel Ellsberg, the analyst who'd leaked the Pentagon papers, hunting for material to discredit him, and the White House had illegally wiretapped its own staff and journalists to plug leaks about the secret Cambodia bombing. They were part of the Plumbers, a clandestine unit dedicated to stopping internal leaks and conducting illegal surveillance on political enemies. The subsequent Senate hearings revealed a culture of lawlessness in the White House, including illegal wiretapping, tax audits, and the use of government agencies for political sabotage. Nixon likely didn't order the break-in, but he absolutely authorized the cover-up. When the Supreme Court orders him to hand over Oval Office tapes, the cover-up is proven beyond dispute. Nixon resigns on August 9, 1974. In the Saturday Night Massacre, Nixon fired the special prosecutor investigating him, a move so brazen it triggered a wave of public outrage. Facing certain removal from office after the release of the smoking gun tape, Nixon resigned, the only president to ever do so. Congress does try to legislate a fix directly. In 1973, over Nixon's veto, it passes the War Powers Act, requiring presidents to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing troops abroad and limiting deployments to 90 days without formal authorization, a direct response to both Vietnam's undeclared war and Watergate's executive overreach. Presidents from both parties have found workarounds to that law in nearly every military engagement since. Watergate's damage runs deeper than one presidency. It teaches an entire generation of Americans to assume their government is lying to them by default, a genuinely new baseline of institutional distrust that Vietnam had already started cracking and Watergate finishes breaking. The underlying question Watergate first forced into the open at this scale, how much unchecked power an American president can quietly accumulate before someone actually stops him, has never fully closed. Vietnam and Watergate created a new baseline of cynicism as Americans increasingly viewed their government with deep and lasting suspicion. In 1971, Nixon decoupled the dollar from gold, ending the Bretton Woods system that had provided global economic stability since 1944. Underneath all the political drama, the actual economic ground Americans stood on was shifting too, and it never really shifted back. In 1971, Nixon ends the dollar's convertibility into gold, unraveling the Bretton Woods monetary system that had anchored the global economy since the end of World War II. Then, in October 1973, OPEC imposes an embargo on the United States specifically to punish it for supporting Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices skyrocket, and the effects ripple through the entire economy. Inflation and unemployment rise together, producing stagflation and a new metric, the misery index, that simply adds the unemployment rate to the inflation rate. The U.S. entered a period of stagflation, the combination of high inflation and high unemployment that defied standard economic theories. Factories increasingly relocate from the unionized Rust Belt of the Northeast and Midwest to the non-union Sun Belt of the South and Southwest, chasing cheaper labor or leave the country entirely. Squeezed taxpayers respond with open revolt. In 1978, California voters passed Proposition 13, slashing property taxes and, with them, the primary funding source for public schools and local services, and roughly a dozen states follow with similar measures within a few years. Supply-side economists offer a new theory to justify further cuts. Lower tax rates, they argue, will actually increase government revenue by spurring so much new investment and job growth that a smaller slice of a much bigger economic pie ends up larger in total. An argument that becomes the intellectual backbone of Reagan-era economics just a few years later. Factories increasingly relocate from the unionized Rust Belt of the Northeast and Midwest to the non-union Sun Belt of the South and Southwest, chasing cheaper labor or leave the country entirely. Squeezed taxpayers respond with open revolt. In 1978, California voters passed Proposition 13, slashing property taxes and, with them, the primary funding source for public schools and local services, and roughly a dozen states follow with similar measures within a few years. Supply-side economists offer a new theory to justify further cuts. Lower tax rates, they argue, will actually increase government revenue by spurring so much new investment and job growth that a smaller slice of a much bigger economic pie ends up larger in total, an argument that becomes the intellectual backbone of Reagan-era economics just a few years later. This era saw the rise of supply-side economics, popularized by Arthur Laffer, which promised that tax cuts would create prosperity through trickle-down growth. This is the exact decade when the secure blue-collar pathway to the middle class, the one that had defined the entire post-war boom, starts narrowing for good. College becomes both more necessary and more expensive. At almost the same moment, public school funding starts shrinking under tax revolts like Proposition 13. If you've ever wondered why your own generation talks constantly about gig work, student debt, and the sense that a stable job with a pension basically doesn't exist anymore, this is where that story genuinely begins, not as an abstract modern complaint, but as a direct continuation of an economic shift that starts in these exact years and never really reversed. At the same time, the cost of higher education began to soar, beginning the long-term trend of student debt that would plague future generations. But 1970s ended with a sense of economic malaise, as the American dream of ever-increasing prosperity seemed to be slipping away for many. Despite everything in the last three sections, this is not simply a decade of liberal retreat. Congress passes Title IX in 1972, banning sex discrimination at any school receiving federal funding, a law whose most visible legacy, the explosion of women's college athletics, is still expanding decades later. Attorney Ruth Bader Ginsburg, arguing before the Supreme Court for the ACLU, wins case after case establishing that the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause applies to sex discrimination too, effectively building the legal foundation for gender equality one careful precedent at a time. Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the ACLU built the legal foundation for modern gender equality, winning landmark cases that redefined the Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Rights Amendment nearly ratifies before Phyllis Schlafly's Stop ERA campaign stalls it. Meanwhile, the Combahee River Collective insists that race, class, and gender can't actually be separated, an idea formalized as intersectionality. Phyllis Schlafly's Stop ERA campaign successfully argued that the amendment would destroy traditional protections for housewives and the family. At the 1977 National Women's Conference, the clash between feminist goals and conservative counter-rallies signaled the birth of the modern culture war. Simultaneously, black feminists in the Combahee River Collective were articulating a new framework, intersectionality, to describe overlapping systems of oppression. Chicana feminists also organized, insisting that their fight for liberation addressed the specific realities of race, class, and gender in their communities. The Supreme Court's Bakke decision in 1978 struck down quotas but protected the use of race as a factor in admissions, a landmark for affirmative action. In 1977, disabled activists occupied a federal building in San Francisco for 25 days to force the government to implement Section 504. Grassroots environmentalism also gained power. Disasters like Love Canal forced the government to act against the poisoning of American neighborhoods. Investigations revealed that toxic waste sites were overwhelmingly placed in black and brown communities, leading to the term environmental racism. Indigenous activists also mobilized for land rights and sovereignty, tying environmental policy directly to the legacy of colonialism and racial justice. While liberals kept winning individual legal and legislative battles, conservatives were quietly building something more durable than any single election: institutions. In 1971, corporate lawyer Lewis Powell writes a confidential memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, warning that America's free enterprise system is under coordinated attack, and urging business leaders to fund a permanent counter-infrastructure, think tanks, legal foundations, media operations, all built to shape public opinion and court decisions over the long term, rather than just backing individual candidates every election cycle. Historians treat the Powell memo as the actual blueprint for outfits like the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute. While liberals kept winning individual legal and legislative battles, conservatives were quietly building something more durable than any single election: institutions. In 1971, corporate lawyer Lewis Powell writes a confidential memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, warning that America's free enterprise system is under coordinated attack and urging business leaders to fund a permanent counter-infrastructure. Think tanks, legal foundations, media operations, all built to shape public opinion and court decisions over the long term, rather than just backing individual candidates every election cycle. Historians treat the Powell memo as the actual blueprint for outfits like the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute. Richard Viguerie revolutionized politics by using direct mail to bypass the media and raise millions from small donors around emotional, identity-based issues. In 1979, televangelist Jerry Falwell founds the Moral Majority, explicitly organizing conservative evangelicals around pro-family politics, opposition to abortion after Roe, resistance to gay rights and the ERA, support for school prayer, and hardline anti-communism. Falwell is refreshingly blunt about what the organization actually is. Totally political, in his own words, dressed in the language of moral revival. Within 2 years, it claims 4 million members ready to organize for new right candidates. In 1979, televangelist Jerry Falwell founds the Moral Majority, explicitly organizing conservative evangelicals around pro-family politics, opposition to abortion after Roe, resistance to gay rights and the ERA, support for school prayer, and hardline anti-communism. Falwell is refreshingly blunt about what the organization actually is, totally political, in his own words, dressed in the language of moral revival. Within 2 years, it claims 4 million members ready to organize for new right candidates. Weakened by the Iran hostage crisis, energy shortages, and stagflation all landing in his lap at once, Carter loses badly to Ronald Reagan in 1980, and the institutional machinery this whole chapter just spent describing, the think tanks, the religious right, the tax revolt, the law and order playbook from 1968, all of it finally has a president ready and willing to use it at full scale. President Carter's Malaise speech attempted to address a national crisis of confidence, but many Americans instead heard a leader blaming the people for his own failures. In 1979, the U.S. began covertly arming Afghan fighters against the Soviets, a Cold War victory with a very long and dangerous tail. These proxy wars would eventually birth networks and figures that would return to haunt American foreign policy for decades after 9/11. Ronald Reagan's 1980 victory was the culmination of these 12 years of conservative organizing, promising a new morning in America. The institutional machinery was finally in place, and a president was ready to use it to reshape the nation's political and economic landscape completely. We end where we began, with Schlafly and Murray, two extraordinary women who understood that in the modern era, identity is the most potent form of political power. Their disagreement over freedom and identity was never resolved. Instead, it became the permanent architecture of American political life. Both sides of American politics learned, in these exact 12 years, how to turn personal identity into durable political power. The Combahee River Collective does it from the left, insisting race, gender, class, and sexuality can't be separated. The New Right does it from the right, packaging tax revolts and family values and religious identity into one coalition built to outlast any single candidate or election cycle. That's the actual inheritance you're carrying, whether you clock it consciously or not. Nearly every fight you see online about identity, about who belongs in which political coalition, about flags and pronouns and mascots and school curricula, runs through infrastructure that both sides of this argument were actively constructing in exactly this decade. From flags to pronouns to the very definition of a stable life, you are still carrying the inheritance of these 12 transformative years. Get your Chapter 27 source response done in Canvas, and next time, we watch the New Right finally get its president and the country reshaped completely in the process. See you in Chapter 28.